so long for the United Nations to come up with a solution, a peaceful solution. And we have gone from a ceasefire to the resumption of
لقد ذهبنا من وقف إطلاق النار إلى عودة الكفاح المسلح.
Hello. Can everybody hear me?
هل يمكنكم سماعي؟
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is quite regrettable, and
هذا أمر مؤسف للغاية.
Sorry, I don't get the translation.
Sorry, Gianfranco. Apparently, there is a problem with the channel of the translation, that the Arabic is coming in.
Oui, j'entends.
Okay.
C'est aux Meima et aux techniciens de résoudre le problème.
But I will continue. So it was Arabic translation, yeah? Thank you. I think it is time for us to really seriously looking at tangible results in
يجب
every
أن نبحث عن نتائج ملموسة.
effort which we make. I think I see our friend Pedro Pinto later there. He would probably say something as well later about what I am going to say. About 4 years ago in Lisbon at the Portuguese Parliament, Pedro and friends organized a seminar where I also participated and spoke. The resistance leader of Timor-Leste, Xanana Guzmão, said something which I think is still relevant, which is that for us to have a clear plan whereby we can, everybody can contribute, every effort can be fit into the plan, an overall plan which is led by our Sahrawi friends. And this time it has to be one which the results can be clearly assessed, and every backlash can be addressed as well. Otherwise, we wait for 30 years, there is no referendum, and then what now? We are going back to fighting. So when is it going to end? In Lisbon, which I'd like to remind friends here as well, Ms. Xanana Guzmão took Timorese experience as an example. When we, in the 90s, the National Resistance of the National Council of Timorese Resistance issued what we call the peace plan. This is a plan which accumulate all the effort which is done by the Timorese resistance itself, but also can welcome the contribution of solidarity groups worldwide. I think although the situation has changed so much between 1999, when Timor-Leste finally had its referendum, and today, I think a plan of that kind of magnitude has become necessary. Otherwise, we are meeting at seminars and discussing, and after that, what do we do? Those of us who are in Timor-Leste, we come back to our corner in the middle of nowhere, and then what can we do? What kind of real contribution can we make to the struggle of Sahrawi for independence? I think this is, it's more, I leave it more like a question for all of us to try and address rather than to provide a solution. So I leave it at that, and I'll be happy to join everybody in the discussion. Thank you.
I thank you, Ambassador de Fonseca. You are right. There must be a political will to find a solution. And that's why we are questioning United States, France, and Spain policy towards Western Sahara. Et maintenant, je vais donner la parole, donc on parle de ces trois pays, et notamment la France et l'Espagne jouent également un rôle déterminant au sein de l'Union européenne. Je vais donc donner la parole à Monsieur Pierre Galland, sénateur honoraire de Belgique, qui travaille depuis longtemps également au sein des institutions européennes à Bruxelles et qui va nous entretenir justement du rôle de l'Union européenne dans la question du Sahara occidental. Pierre, tu as la parole.
Oui, merci. Bonjour à chacun d'entre vous. Bonjour, Excellence. Bonjour, cher Gianfranco. Bonjour à Oubi, cher ministre, et à vous tous qui participez à cette conférence importante qui devrait quelque part, nous réjouir. Nous réjouir parce que depuis hier, voilà que l'administration, le président Biden a clairement rejeté l'arrêt de M. Trump. Et voilà que les États-Unis vont retrouver leur crédibilité au sein des Nations Unies. Pour nous, en Europe, c'est important et je tenais à saluer cette décision prise sous la pression d'abord de tous ceux qui, à travers le monde, se sont mobilisés pour dire aux démocrates américains qu'il fallait absolument revoir cette décision de M. Trump et qu'il fallait à tout prix que les États-Unis retrouvent la voie du multilatéralisme de l'ONU et participent à la solution du conflit du Sahara occidental. C'est important parce que vous savez comme moi que lorsque les États-Unis éternuent, l'Europe a un rhume. Et donc, ça va certainement être une façon de soutenir ceux qui, en Europe, au Parlement européen, principalement, mais aussi dans certains États européens, je tiens à saluer la position de l'Angleterre, la position de l'Irlande, la position de la Suède, la position de l'Allemagne. N'oublions pas, ces pays ont une voix et nous pouvons compter sur eux pour essayer de faire en sorte que l'Europe respecte ses engagements. Et à cet égard, je voudrais simplement rappeler que l'Europe prétend toujours et affirme avec force à travers l'ensemble de ses déclarations qu'elle entend respecter les droits humains, respecter le droit international, respecter sa propre charte européenne des droits fondamentaux des personnes qu'elle avait adoptée en l'année 2000, qu'elle avait rendue aussi contraignante grâce au dernier traité, le dernier traité sur lequel repose toute l'institution, toute la construction européenne, c'est le traité de Lisbonne de 2009. Et à cet égard, de vous dire que, en fait, l'Europe se déclare soucieuse de l'ensemble des violations aux droits humains et à l'ensemble des violations du droit international qui sont commises non seulement sur son territoire, mais avec les pays avec lesquels elle entretient des accords bilatéraux de coopération. Or, nous sommes vraiment dans ce cas de figure, et déjà alors en 2015, l'Europe avait demandé un rapport sur sa politique extérieure. Et dans cette politique extérieure, l'Europe réaffirmait ses obligations, réaffirmait qu'il y avait un cadre juridique non seulement international, mais un cadre juridique européen qui définissait quelles étaient les règles qu'elle devait adopter à l'égard des États qui eux-mêmes se trouvaient dans des situations d'occupation ou qui utilisaient les ressources naturelles d'un autre État. Elle avait qualifié aussi ce qu'était l'occupation illégale des territoires et de ce qu'était sa responsabilité et de l'ensemble des États tiers. Or, dans la situation du Sahara occidental et du Maroc, nous, les Européens, nous sommes clairement États tiers, non seulement en tant qu'Europe, mais en tant que l'ensemble des États qui constituent l'Europe. Et cette étude sur les droits et devoirs de la politique externe de l'Union européenne est vraiment passionnante pour ceux qui veulent la consulter. C'est 71 pages et dans les cas étudiés se trouve le Sahara occidental. Le premier cas étudié, c'est la Palestine, et le deuxième cas étudié, c'est le Sahara occidental, et c'est important parce que clairement, dans cette étude, eh bien, les experts qui ont été choisis par l'Union européenne pour conseiller le haut-commissaire aux relations extérieures ne se gênent pas pour dire et définir clairement ce que c'est que le fait de reconnaître une occupation illégale et que dans le cas du Sahara occidental, il s'agit bien d'une occupation illégale. De même qu'elle dit clairement aussi, cette étude, que lorsqu'il y a des accords bilatéraux qui sont passés avec un État tiers qui lui-même est en situation d'occupation illégale d'un autre territoire, il est clair que cette occupation doit être exclue des accords bilatéraux et que c'est bien dans le cadre des frontières internationalement reconnues de ce pays que doit se fixer l'accord de coopération. Or, vous savez comme moi que l'Europe a fait exactement l'inverse dans ses derniers accords de coopération avec le Portugal. Et de même, le rapport énonce clairement que l'Europe se doit de dénoncer les violations des droits civils et politiques à l'égard des citoyens des pays occupés, en l'occurrence aujourd'hui à l'égard des citoyens sahraouis, et que l'Europe doit veiller, et c'est intéressant de relire tout ça parce que, disent-ils, en 2015, l'Europe doit veiller à la protection des ressources naturelles de cet État. Or, aujourd'hui, nos pays, et mon pays en particulier, ne se gênent pas pour passer des accords de coopération qui incluent les ressources naturelles des territoires sahraouis occupés. Alors, voilà, je pense que c'était important de clarifier cela parce que nous sommes à la veille de la décision de la Cour de justice européenne. Et c'est très important parce que dans les accords de Lisbonne, il est clairement stipulé que toute violation des droits humains, toute violation du droit international, toute violation des personnes à l'intérieur ou des groupes à l'intérieur de l'Europe, eh bien, il y a des recours possibles et que ces recours se font devant la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme et devant la Cour européenne de justice. Nous sommes à la veille aujourd'hui d'un arrêt qui devrait être pris prochainement par la Cour européenne de justice suite au fait que le Front Polisario a déposé une plainte et un recours contre l'usage qui a été fait de ces ressources naturelles, agricoles, halieutiques et autres. Et je pense que c'est extrêmement intéressant parce que, comme le disait au début Gianfranco, eh bien, si c'est vrai que déjà la Cour, par 2 fois, a clairement défini que le Sahara occidental ne fait pas partie du territoire marocain, n'est pas une partie du territoire marocain, ce qui est extrêmement clair 2 fois, je ne vois pas comment la Cour va pouvoir la 3e fois dire « Ah non, non, on s'est trompé les 2 précédentes ». Donc, nous pouvons être assez optimistes quant à l'arrêt qui va sortir de ce jugement. Jugement important puisque de manière très exceptionnelle, il va être pris par 5 juges, alors qu'en général, les arrêts finaux de la Cour sont pris par 3 juges. Ici, il y a eu 5 juges. Espérons que ça porte effet par le poids de 5 juges plutôt que de 3 ou de 1. Avant de terminer, si Jean-Franco me le permet, je voudrais quand même faire une petite approche de choses qui circulent énormément, y compris au Parlement européen, par des personnalités éminentes, notamment des ministres des Affaires étrangères, comme celui de mon propre pays, qui appellent aujourd'hui à ce qu'on se rallie à ce qu'ils appellent l'offre historique du Maroc d'une large autonomie pour le Sahara occidental. Et à cet égard, je voudrais simplement rappeler l'histoire. Et ce n'est pas Joaquim de Fonseca qui me contredira. Toutes les puissances coloniales, en Afrique, au Timor ou ailleurs, ont toujours, à un moment donné, dans leurs difficultés, dans leur autre, proposé des propositions d'autonomie. Que ce soit déjà durant la guerre du Vietnam, tant les Français que les Américains, avant les accords de Genève, avaient poussé des propositions de large autonomie. Et donc, je pense que nous devons savoir que la large autonomie est toujours une façon discrète pour le colonisateur d'essayer de garder une certaine mainmise sur le territoire qu'il convoite. Et que nous devons donc nous méfier profondément de ce genre de discours qui a cours pour l'instant, y compris au sein du Parlement européen et que nous combattons. Avant de terminer, je voudrais alors... Sorry. Ah, il y a eu une interférence, je continue. Et simplement, en conclusion, Permettez-moi de faire 3 appels. Le premier appel, ce sera à Madame Bachelet. Je connais Madame Bachelet, c'est une éminente personnalité qui a été une très courageuse femme d'opposition à la dictature au Chili et qui a présidé ce pays. Je souhaite et je formule vraiment l'espoir, et nous allons travailler ici en Europe pour que, à Genève, ce message puisse être entendu par Madame Bachelet. Il est temps qu'une mission des Nations Unies pour les droits de l'homme se rende d'urgence dans les territoires occupés, à ce moment-ci en particulier, en ce moment où justement, puisqu'il y a une reprise des conflits qui ont été imposés par le Maroc, eh bien le Maroc, dans le même temps, réprime de manière tout à fait violente et inacceptable les populations sahraouies. Un appel aussi au secrétaire général des Nations Unies. Ce message puisse être entendu par Madame Bachelet. Je m'entends parler, c'est étonnant. Mais le deuxième message, c'est à M. Guterres, un homme aussi qui a un remarquable passé, tant à la tête de son pays lorsqu'il reconnut l'indépendance de Timor, mais aussi aux droits de l'homme, où il a été un haut-commissaire de qualité. Aujourd'hui, aux Nations Unies, nous lui demandons tout particulièrement de faire en sorte que la MINURSO exerce son mandat. Et son mandat, c'est celui de mettre en œuvre le référendum d'autodétermination pour le peuple sahraoui. C'est extrêmement important, et que dans le même temps, il élargisse ce mandat de la MINURSO à la protection des droits de l'homme, que ce soit dans les territoires occupés, dans les territoires libérés ou dans les campements sahraouis. Nous n'oublions pas que être réfugié dans un campement aujourd'hui, c'est la première violation des droits humains d'un peuple. Et enfin, un appel tout particulier aussi au CICR. Il n'est pas normal que le CICR pense qu'il n'a pas obligation de se rendre en visite auprès des prisonniers politiques sahraouis qui sont détenus dans les prisons au Maroc. C'est une anomalie, et nos associations en Europe se mobilisent là aussi pour obtenir que le CICR envoie une mission d'enquête et une mission d'aide auprès des réfugiés, des prisonniers politiques sahraouis. Voilà, mon cher président, animateur, gestionnaire de tout ce groupe merveilleux à partir de Genève, ce que j'entendais apporter comme contribution, en vous saluant tous et en espérant que tous ensemble, avec ce magnifique peuple sahraoui, nous aboutissions à permettre qu'il retrouve la plénitude de ses droits sur son territoire, et cela dans les plus brefs délais. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le sénateur honoraire Galland, notamment d'avoir mis l'accent sur cette incohérence dans l'application du principe de non-reconnaissance et non-assistance à une occupation illégale. C'est ce que se traduit par une forme de soutien à une puissance occupante. Et maintenant, je vais donner la parole à Madame Lucía Muñoz Dalda, qui est membre du Congrès espagnol, a été élue dans les listes du parti Podemos. Señora Muñoz Dalda tiene la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias, estimados señores y señoras. Es un honor doble para mí participar en esta conferencia de alto nivel como acto paralelo al 46 periodo de sesiones de derechos humanos. En primer lugar, porque para Podemos, el partido al que represento como diputada nacional, los derechos humanos son una de nuestras bases. Somos un partido joven que con apenas 7 años de historia puede decir que ha llevado la indignación de las calles al Parlamento y luego al propio gobierno de nuestro país, en un gobierno de coalición con el Partido Socialista. En segundo lugar, porque lo hago en un acto sobre el derecho a la libre determinación del pueblo saharaui. Unas pocas palabras que resumen el compromiso de Podemos con el derecho internacional, el derecho de los pueblos colonizados a emanciparse y el compromiso de nuestro pueblo con el saharaui, como país con el que nuestro país mantiene una deuda histórica. Por estas razones, quiero comenzar mi intervención expresando nuestra máxima preocupación por el aumento de las violaciones de derechos humanos que estamos viendo en ciudades como El Aaiún, Bullador y Esmara, desde que Marruecos rompiera el alto al fuego en el paso fronterizo del Guerguerat. Desde entonces no han parado las acciones contra defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos como Sultana Haya, Mohamed Nafa Butasofra, Galia Bughaya, Mohamed Lamin Yadi. Nuestro partido ha exigido al presidente del Gobierno de España, Pedro Sánchez, y a la ministra de Asuntos Exteriores, Arantxa González Laya, que inicien acciones urgentes para su protección. Estas violaciones de derechos humanos son intolerables. En cualquier lugar del mundo donde hay que asegurar que se pueda ejercer el derecho a la manifestación, a la exigencia de los derechos humanos en toda su integridad política, económica, social y cultural, y más en el Sáhara Occidental, ya que llevamos años sumándonos a las peticiones para que la MINURSO sea una misión como otras de Naciones Unidas y tenga un mandato también en la vigilancia de los derechos humanos. Mantener esta misión sin vigilar los derechos humanos no solo es una dejación de funciones, sino un grave paso para todo el planeta, pues sabemos que si la impunidad no quiere tener fronteras, que solo la lucha de millones de hombres y mujeres nos ha dejado los derechos humanos como una conquista social irrenunciable que podemos exigir en todo el mundo. Quiero seguir con la responsabilidad histórica de nuestro país con el Sáhara Occidental. España debe cumplir con sus obligaciones como potencia colonial que fue. España debe cumplir con las promesas de descolonización que hizo ante los comités de Naciones Unidas y al pueblo saharaui. Es una deuda histórica con el pueblo saharaui. Y también una necesidad para la memoria histórica de nuestro país. La entrega del Sáhara a Marruecos y Mauritania se realizó en un momento muy delicado de nuestra historia, justo cuando murió el dictador Franco, un periodo que nuestro país debe revisar, así como toda la dictadura. Solo con el reconocimiento de todos los crímenes de esta etapa y de la historia de España podremos averiguar los pasos básicos para que todas las personas de nuestro país puedan ver resarcidos sus derechos. Memoria, verdad y reparación son los elementos esenciales para una reparación integral con justicia. Esa memoria es compartida de manera desigual con el pueblo saharaui. Es distinta porque en nuestro país la necesitamos para tener un futuro asentado en la justicia y en el Sáhara Occidental para cumplir con su derecho a la libre determinación. Es compartida porque compartimos los ideales de justicia y un pasado común sellado en la amistad de nuestros pueblos, en el pasado y ahora, con miles de niños y niñas saharauis que están cada verano en nuestro país, con decenas de asociaciones de amistad pueblo saharaui, etc. También es compartida porque ambos dos necesitamos conocer, reparar y hacer memoria de ese periodo compartido durante la dictadura franquista. 45 años después, urge que nuestro país cumpla con su responsabilidad histórica, pero también que el resto de países implicados en la dimensión regional del conflicto también lo hagan. Esta obligación señala fundamentalmente a Marruecos, que debe cumplir el cuerpo de resoluciones de Naciones Unidas que abren una vía clara para una solución justa, pero también al resto de países que avalan una ocupación que sigue provocando que decenas de miles de personas tengan que vivir refugiadas en el derecho. Una ocupación que extrae recursos como fosfatos, pesca, arena, ilegalmente de ese territorio, como lo han reconocido varias sentencias del Tribunal de Justicia Europeo. Pero si hubiera participado en esta conferencia hace un año a esta parte de mi intervención, hubieran seguido las mismas claves de años anteriores que pasaban por el alto al fuego y un proceso de referéndum estancados. Es algo que pude comprobar de primera mano en el Congreso del Polisario, al que asistí en diciembre de 2019. Pero ahora estamos en otro momento. Desde noviembre pasado, en que Marruecos rompió el alto al fuego pactado con el Frente Polisario en 1991 al irrumpir su ejército en el paso del Guerguerat. Estamos ante un conflicto armado otra vez. Desde Podemos estamos profundamente preocupados y preocupadas porque estos incidentes puedan reabrir una guerra tan cruenta como la que durante años enfrentó a los ejércitos de Marruecos y el Polisario, porque estos meses de hostilidades puedan escalar hacia un conflicto regional. Este conflicto sería desastroso. En primer lugar, para la población saharaui, cuya mayor parte vive refugiada, como ya he dicho, pero también para la estabilidad del Magreb y para toda Europa. Y lo sería aún más en este momento de extrema debilidad agravada por la pandemia, en que todas las fuerzas deberían estar puestas en incrementar la acción humanitaria en los campamentos de refugio. Pero no basta con pedir el cese de las hostilidades armadas de un conflicto que se ha alargado debido al incumplimiento del acuerdo de alto al fuego de 1991. No hay que volver a la raíz, hay que volver a la raíz de la solución, que son las resoluciones de Naciones Unidas, que establecen la procedencia de un referéndum de autodeterminación con fundamento en los principios y la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Por eso, desde nuestros grupos parlamentarios en el Parlamento Europeo, en el Congreso de los Diputados y en los parlamentos regionales, hemos exigido poner en marcha acciones en 6 campos. Primero, instamos a la ONU y a la MINURSO a garantizar el mantenimiento del alto al fuego quebrado por Marruecos en Guerguerat, para que no derive la situación en una escalada que acabe en guerra abierta entre las partes. Segundo, pedimos al secretario general de la ONU el nombramiento de un representante especial con la responsabilidad única sobre la organización del referéndum asistido por MINURSO. Son ya demasiados meses sin el decisivo impulso de una representación especial que siempre ha empujado por una solución justa. También pedimos al Gobierno español que trabaje en Naciones Unidas para que la MINURSO cumpla la resolución 690 del Consejo de Seguridad del 29 de abril de 1991, que mandata la organización de un referéndum con el establecimiento de un calendario y un censo justo, así como fijar las garantías para su cumplimiento. Además, conforme a lo establecido en la resolución 2548, aprobada por el Consejo de Seguridad el 30 de octubre de 2020, reafirmamos nuestro compromiso, que debe ser el de la Unión Europea y toda la comunidad internacional, de ayudar a las partes a alcanzar una solución política justa, duradera y aceptable para todas, basada en la aveniencia que prevea la libre determinación del pueblo del Sáhara Occidental en el marco de disposiciones conformes a los principios y propósitos de la Carta de Naciones Unidas. España, como potencia administradora que aún figura así en Naciones Unidas, debe colaborar y contribuir a la aplicación de las anteriores resoluciones y seguir dialogando con las partes para no agudizar el conflicto y la vuelta al alto al fuego. Por último, la Unión Europea debe trabajar para evitar la guerra y solucionar un conflicto que dura ya 30 años para alcanzar una solución conforme a lo establecido en las resoluciones de Naciones Unidas, especialmente la 2548 de 30 de octubre de 2020 y el apoyo de un nuevo enviado especial. Estos son los principios que ahora deberían guiar la acción de nuestro país, sumados a la presión para evitar violaciones de derechos humanos y seguir la legalidad internacional con los recursos naturales. Nada más y muchísimas gracias.
C'est moi qui vous remercie, Madame Muñoz Dalda, en particulier d'avoir rappelé la responsabilité historique, mais je dirais juridique aussi de l'Espagne dans la question de la décolonisation du Sahara occidental. Et bon, on peut espérer que la participation de votre parti au sein de la coalition gouvernementale amènera votre pays à changer rapidement de politique sur cette question pour arriver enfin à la solution du processus de décolonisation dans le cadre des normes du droit international relatives aux territoires non autonomes. Je vous remercie beaucoup pour votre participation. Et maintenant, je vais donner la parole au professeur Carlos Ruiz Miguel, professeur de droit constitutionnel à l'Université de Santiago de Compostela, qui, je pense, va nous parler justement en détail des responsabilités juridiques de l'Espagne dans ce dossier. Professeur, vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much for this invitation to participate in this webinar. And I have been asked to talk about the blocus of the right to self-determination and independence of the people of Western Sahara and the responsibility of Spain as administering power. And I would like to talk about four points. My presentation will be divided in 4 points. First, I will talk briefly about the status of Spain as administering power. Then I will talk about what are the legal obligations of Spain as administering power. And then third, I would like to present some reflections about what can and must do Spain as administering power to preserve the right to self-determination and independence of Western Sahara. And finally, I will summarize the presentation with some conclusions. Well, the status of Spain as administering power is clear since 1961. In that date, it was Spain itself which communicated to the United Nations that the Western Sahara was a non-self-governing territory. Then, no doubt that the legal status of Spain from that date is not of an occupying power, but of an administering power with a legal title to be in the Western Sahara as a nation that has a colony, but not an occupying power, but I insist, an administering power. Well, you all know that the Madrid Agreement of 1975 established an interim administration until February of 1976, interim tripartite administration composed by Spain, Mauritania, and Morocco. Well, February of 1976 is gone. What happened now? Well, as the Undersecretary for Legal Affairs, Hans Korel, stated clearly, Spain could not discharge itself from its duties as administering power. The transfer of this status was illegal. Hence, now Spain remains the administering power of the territory, although Spain has not the control of the land of the territory. But we should not forget that Spain still has attributed the control of the airspace of the territory of Western Sahara. Then I finish this first point. Spain is still now the administering power of the Western Sahara, but it's an administering power de jure, not de facto. And this is why in the reports of the Secretary General concerning the information provided to the United Nations by the colonial powers about their colonies, always, still now, the Secretary General refers to Spain as the administering power of the Western Sahara. So it's clear that Spain is still now the administering power of Western Sahara. What are their obligations then? So their obligations could be classified in two kinds. First of all, there are political obligations, and then there are economic and social obligations. The political obligation of an administering power for territory is to decolonize, and the decolonization of Western Sahara, as the International Court of Justice said in 1975, is to be done through a referendum of self-determination if Spain itself does not grant directly the independence to the territory, as it could be done at the time. So this is the political obligation of the administration to provide for the decolonization according to the international law, which means that the decolonization of the Western Sahara might be done either by recognizing directly the independence of the territory or by holding a referendum where the people might choose their own destiny. There is also another kind of obligations that they are economic, social, educational obligations. In this sense, the administering power is obliged to preserve the riches of the territory so that those riches should be administered by the people itself when it gets the fully independence, when they are fully decolonized. In this sense, it's clear that agreements like those signed by the European Union with Morocco concerning the Sahara waters do not respect those obligations, because Spain, of course, is a member of the European Union and has a duty to preserve those riches of Western Sahara when the European Union negotiates such an agreement with Morocco. I go then to the third point. I don't want to abuse from the time you gently granted me. What can and must do Spain as administering power, de jure, to preserve the right to self-determination and independence of Western Sahara? Well, if we speak about the referendum, of course, Spain should promote the referendum of self-determination. But now we all know that the referendum is blocked. So in this context, nowadays, what must be done by Spain? First, I think there are two things that Spain can do. First of all, Spain has the legal duty not just to ignore, but also to oppose to any attempt to annex the territory in disregard of the decolonization of the territory. It means that every state that claimed that the Western Sahara is annexed or a part of Morocco without an act of self-determination of the people of Western Sahara is a state which promotes a violation of the international law and opposed to the legal responsibility of Spain to decolonize properly the territory. So there is an obligation of Spain not just to ignore, but to actively oppose any attempt of annexation of the Western Sahara, no matter which country states such a so-called recognition of sovereignty, and you all know what I'm talking about. Second, in the event that the occupying power does not respect its legal obligation to allow the implementation of the right to self-determination and independence of the people of Western Sahara, the administering power, which is obliged to decolonize, should recognize the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. In this sense, I think that the question was correctly addressed by the Mbeki doctrine. You all know that at that time, President of South Africa, Mr. Thabo Mbeki, sent on 1st August 2004 an extremely important letter to the King of Morocco. In this letter, the President of South Africa justified why South Africa recognized the Sahrawi Republic, and the doctrine of President Mbeki is fully applicable to Spain and any other states of the international community. Let me quote the words of President Mbeki. The avoidable cul-de-sac caused by the positions advanced by the government of Morocco has created the situation that any further delay on our part to recognize Sahrawi Republic will inevitably translate into an abandonment of our support of the right of the people of Western Sahara to self-determination. For us, not to recognize Sahrawi Republic in this situation is to become an accessory to the denial of the people of Western Sahara of the right to self-determination. These could constitute a grave and unacceptable betrayal of our commitment to respect the Charter of the United Nations and the Constitutive Act of the African Union. Well, I come to the end. Let me summarize the conclusions that I think could be drawn from my words. First of all, the legal status of Spain as administering power is clear. It does not depend on the fact that Spain has no more the control of the land. Still without the control of the land, Spain has responsibilities that should be fulfilled at this stage. Second, as an administering power, de jure, not de facto, Spain still has obligations of political and economic nature. Third, the developments of the case show that Spain has not fulfilled its obligations concerning the economic issues, concerning the agreements between the European Union and Morocco. Fourth, by virtue of its status as an administering power, Spain is obliged to actively oppose to any attempt to make a so-called recognition of sovereignty of Morocco over the Western Sahara. And finally, if Morocco does not immediately commit to hold the referendum of self-determination, Spain is obliged to recognize the Sahrawi Republic. I thank you for your attention.
I thank you, Professor Ruiz Miguel, in particular for having highlighted Spain's responsibilities and obligations, whether they are political or economic and social. And we just hope that your voice will be heard in the Spanish government and it will abandon the current policy of complicity with the Kingdom of Morocco. And with this, je vais passer la parole à Monsieur Pascal Thor, professeur universitaire, responsable adjoint aux relations internationales du Parti communiste français. Monsieur Thor, vous avez la parole.
C'est bon. Oui, bonjour à tous. C'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je vous retrouve ici. Alors, en dépit de la charte et des résolutions des Nations Unies qui appellent l'organisation d'un référendum d'autodétermination sur l'indépendance, le Maroc occupe toujours illégalement le Sahara occidental depuis 1975. Il entrave ainsi le processus de décolonisation qui n'ont que trop duré, constitue une remise en cause internationale. Ils ont en même temps favorisé la violation des droits humains. Attendez, je vais enlever le... J'entends le... L'enlisement du conflit était une remise en cause flagrante de la légalité, favorise la violation des droits humains. Si les États-Unis ou l'Espagne, comme ancienne puissance coloniale, c'est ce qui a été dit précédemment, portent une lourde responsabilité dans la situation actuelle, cela ne dédouane en rien la France qui a donné son aval à l'occupation et qui, par tous les moyens, aujourd'hui, la conforte pour la pérenniser. Et la France mène quotidiennement chez diplomatique pour rendre irréversible la domination marocaine. Alors, en raison des relations économiques intenses, d'alliances stratégiques régionales, mais aussi de réseaux de connivence très forts qui unissent les sphères dirigeantes des deux pays, Paris s'affirme comme un soutien inconditionnel de la monarchie chérifienne. Alors on peut égrener plusieurs éléments, mais il n'est pas inutile de les rappeler. Il est évidemment de notoriété publique que l'invasion du Sahara occidental s'est réalisée avec l'aval et l'appui des dirigeants français de l'époque. Depuis, Paris fait obstacle à toutes les résolutions de l'ONU, jusqu'à proclamer, il y a quelques années, qu'elle utilisera son droit de veto au sein du Conseil de sécurité pour tout ce qui concerne la préservation des intérêts politiques de Rabat.
Monsieur Thor, on ne vous entend plus. Activez votre micro, Monsieur Thor.
C'est bon, vous m'entendez?
Oui, là c'est bon.
Oui, on a eu une petite coupure. Oui, je disais que Paris avait salué toute la portée. Par exemple, bloquer l'extension à la protection des droits humains dans les territoires dans l'intervention de notre camarade de Podemos. Si bien qu'aujourd'hui, à l'abri réprime tandis que les prisonniers politiques, d'autres, mais en cet instant, en paient les lourds tributs. Et je voulais dire aussi que mes pensées vont vers Nama Asfari, dont vous comprendrez bien pourquoi j'évoque le nom ici. Alors, cette politique déplorable avait les actions de la MINURSO, et en particulier de son émissaire, Heurt Scolaire, ce qui a contribué à son échec et à sa démission anticipée. Par ailleurs, Paris laisse faire les violences politiques de Mohamed VI sur son propre territoire. Je prendrai deux exemples. Il n'y a pas une initiative de solidarité avec le peuple sahraoui ou des nervis téléguidés par l'ambassade du Maroc, en toute intimité, tentent de saboter les initiatives. Et je voudrais rappeler qu'il y a quelques mois, l'Institut du monde arabe s'est plié à la volonté de Rabat en déprogrammant la soirée de solidarité artistique prévue avec la chanteuse Aziza Brahim. Ces derniers jours, les quotidiens nationaux français ont été assaillis de pression comme rarement on en a connu, pour avoir publié des articles qui ont protesté contre le marchandage entre Trump, Netanyahou et Mohamed VI. Et sur ce point particulier, Paris n'a émis aucune condamnation de la déclaration de Trump. Et son silence est lourd de menaces, d'autant que quelques jours après, un membre de la majorité, membre de la Commission des Affaires étrangères, s'est rendu sur un plateau de télévision marocain pour affirmer la marocanité du Sahara occidental. Et il a invité le gouvernement français à en faire de même. Alors, la déclaration récente du président des États-Unis constitue un premier pas positif qu'il reste évidemment à concrétiser. Dans le même registre du soutien de la France à la politique du Maroc, la France encourage la prédation coloniale. Elle encourage notamment un certain nombre d'investissements d'entreprises. Je songe notamment à une association qui promeut des activités sportives et qui s'appelle l'UCPA, qui est relativement important et qui a investi dans les territoires occupés. Mais surtout, Paris a joué un rôle déterminant dans l'extension des tarifs douaniers préférentiels aux territoires occupés du Sahara occidental. Et il s'agit là d'un véritable coup de force de l'Union européenne qui contredit les décisions de la Cour européenne de justice et qui traduit, ne nous y trompons pas, la volonté d'entériner l'occupation et de piller les ressources naturelles. Enfin, ce parti pris de la France est lourd de menaces, car il nourrit les dangers sécuritaires. La région connaît des tensions, des défis, comme le trafic des êtres humains, la drogue, le terrorisme. Et les exemples abondent qui témoignent du jeu pour le moins trouble de Rabat dans tous ces domaines, et plus particulièrement sur le chantage aux migrants. Comment la France, qui proclame partout mener le combat contre le terrorisme et les trafics, peut-elle soutenir inconditionnellement le Maroc? Les revendications territoriales marocaines dans la région constituent aussi un autre motif de tension, d'instabilité et de course aux armements. N'oublions pas, parce qu'on l'évoque trop peu dans le débat, le projet du Grand Maroc, qui englobe non seulement le Sahara occidental, mais aussi une partie de la Mauritanie, de l'Algérie, du Mali et du Nord Sénégal. Et l'agression marocaine commise dans la zone de Guerguerat ces dernières semaines a fait voler en éclats le cessez-le-feu et a relancé les affrontements dont le Maroc porte l'entière responsabilité. Alors cet état de guerre permanent permet au Maghreb d'asseoir sa légitimité sur l'occupation, mais de faire subir aussi à tout le peuple marocain sa politique d'oppression. Les Sahraouis sont un peuple pacifique qui respecte le droit international. Dans des conditions souvent très difficiles, privés de moyens, ils mettent en œuvre dans les territoires occupés un projet politique qui est fondé sur des institutions démocratiques et des politiques émancipatrices, respectueuses des droits individuels et des droits collectifs. La France, qui est toujours soucieuse de distribuer des brevets de droits de l'homme, serait bien inspirée de soutenir ce projet politique qui permet l'accès à l'éducation, aux droits des femmes. Le Front Polisario, qui est le représentant du peuple sahraoui, a multiplié en vain ces dernières années les initiatives de paix en faisant d'innombrables concessions afin de créer les conditions d'une confiance mutuelle. Il s'est heurté en toutes circonstances à une fin de non-recevoir. Eh bien, dans la période nouvelle qui s'ouvre, période faite de tension, je voulais vous dire le soutien total que nous apportons au Front Polisario. Le blocage actuel, il est avant tout politique. Et en France, ce qui nous importe, c'est de mobiliser avec plus de force les opinions publiques pour nourrir le débat et surtout modifier le rapport de force. D'autant que l'Afrique du Nord connaît une période de forte instabilité, que des mécanismes de fragmentation sont à l'œuvre, que l'autoritarisme bride les aspirations démocratiques des peuples. La France doit impérativement changer radicalement de politique à l'égard du Sahara occidental, afin de rechercher une issue politique juste, pacifique, respectueuse du droit des peuples. Et puis surtout, et c'est notre conviction, les Sahraouis sont un atout pour la stabilité régionale et pour la coopération. Alors plus que jamais, il faut que la France réponde favorablement à la main tendue du Front Polisario. Nous faisons entendre au Sénat et à l'Assemblée nationale cette voix. Et la paix, c'est d'abord l'application des résolutions de l'ONU, le respect des droits humains et surtout la mise en œuvre du référendum d'autodétermination. Voilà, je vous remercie.
C'est moi qui vous remercie, Monsieur Thor. Malgré les difficultés techniques, on a bien saisi votre message, et notamment portant sur les relations que l'ancienne puissance coloniale entretient encore aujourd'hui, des relations parfois troubles, notamment, comme vous l'avez dit, lorsqu'il soutient un pays qui est fortement impliqué dans des trafics de tout genre, et aussi par rapport à l'incohérence dans l'application de la politique des droits de l'homme au niveau international, quand on entend la France se positionner par rapport à la situation au Venezuela, en Corée du Nord, en Iran, aujourd'hui en Birmanie, mais qui ne veut pas qu'on parle des violations des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental. Donc, merci beaucoup. Et maintenant, je vais donner lecture du message que 27 sénateurs américains ont lancé au président Biden. Parmi ces 27 sénateurs, il y en a 13 républicains, 13 démocrates et un indépendant. Donc, le message que ces 27 sénateurs ont adressé au président Biden est le suivant. The abrupt decision by the previous administration on December 11, 2020 to officially recognize the Kingdom of Morocco's illegitimate claims of sovereignty over Western Sahara was short-sighted, undermined decades of consistent US policy, and alienated a significant number of African nations. We respectfully urge you to reverse this misguided decision and recommit the United States to the pursuit of a referendum on self-determination for the Sahrawi people of Western Sahara. The fate of the Sahrawi people has been in limbo since the United Nations first adopted a resolution calling for a referendum on self-determination in 1966. For more than 5 decades following the United Nations action, the simple and fundamental goal of the Sahrawi people to freely decide for themselves their fate has been stymied and subjected to broken promise after broken promise. The issue of Morocco's claims of sovereignty over Western Sahara is not new. The International Court of Justice rejected such claims in 1975, stating clearly that the materials and information provided by Morocco did not establish any tie of territorial sovereignty between the territory of Western Sahara and the Kingdom of Morocco. Despite the court's unambiguous judgment, Morocco maintained its unlawful claim to Western Sahara and, after the colonization, attempted to annex the territory with force. The people of Western Sahara, acting through the Polisario, defended their rights and land. After more than a decade of violence, the United Nations finally intervened in 1991, and both sides agreed to a ceasefire and a path forward. Under the so-called settlement plan, Morocco and Western Sahara agreed to hold a referendum and establish the United Nations mission for the referendum in Western Sahara, a mission that has been repeatedly extended and continues to the current day. Subsequent diplomatic efforts, including those led by former Secretary of State James Baker, worked multiple plans with Morocco and Western Sahara, including, notably, the so-called Houston Agreement that recommitted Morocco and Western Sahara in 1997 to a referendum on self-determination. Morocco, recognizing they will likely lose a vote, effectively walked away from the negotiations that following year by declaring they will never accept a referendum that included independence as a potential outcome, despite years of promises otherwise. Tragically, Morocco's unwillingness to negotiate in good faith has been a consistent theme over the years. The previous administration's decision to recognize their claim has only served to reward decades of bad behavior by the Moroccan government. The situation in Western Sahara has been called a frozen conflict, where no resolution exists, yet there is no perceived active conflict. This makes it easy for the rest of the world to forget about the plight of the Sahrawi people. To call this a frozen conflict makes it seem harmless, when the reality is that it is anything but that. Tens and tens of thousands of Sahrawis live in refugee camps, primarily in Tindouf, Algeria. They have been forced from their homes, waiting for a resolution. Allowing this process to stall year after year has cost them a generation of freedom. Some of us have visited those camps many times, as recently as 2019, where we saw clearly their persistence and hope. The United States owes it to the Sahrawi people to honor our commitment to help ensure Moroccan life up to theirs and to see this referendum through. The Sahrawi people deserve the right to freely choose their own destiny. We hope that we can count on you to be a partner in this effort. Sincerely, signed by James Imhoff, a Republican, Chairman of the Senate Armed Service Committee, and Patrick Leahy, Democrat, current President pro tempore of the United States Senate. Also signed the appeal, John Boozman, Angus King Jr., Mike Rounds, Joe Manchin III, John Hoven, Deb Fisher, Richard Selby, Sheldon Whitehouse, Maria Cantwell, Susan McCollins, Rob Portman, Kevin Kramer, Shelley Moore Capito, Cory Brooker, Lisa Markowski, Jack Reed, Kirsten Sinema, Roger Wicker, Mazie Hirono, Cindy Hyde-Smith, Jean Shannon, Chris Van Hollen, Mark Kelly, Ben Ray Lujan, and Dick Durbin. And with this, I will pass the floor to Professor Stefan Zunas, Professor of Politics at San Francisco University. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be part of this gathering. It is very awkward for me now to come to you as an American because on December 10th, the United States became the only major country to formally recognize Morocco's illegal annexation of Western Sahara. Trump's proclamation is directly counter to a series of United Nations Security Council resolutions and a landmark World Court ruling calling for self-determination. Trump's decision was part of a deal in which Morocco would formally recognize Israel. Trump had previously broken precedent by recognizing Israel's illegal annexation of Syria's Golan Heights and the annexation of its illegal settlements in the West Bank. The recognition of the annexation of an entire nation, however, the nation that has been recognized as an independent state by no less than 80 countries, establishes a particularly dangerous precedent and constitutes an egregious violation of international legal norms, effectively putting the world's most powerful nation on record rejecting the right of self-determination in favor of the right of conquest. And since Western Sahara is a full member state of the African Union, the United States is now on record endorsing the conquest of one recognized African state by another. This not only seriously damages the US reputation on the continent, but even encourages other countries to believe that they too could get away with such territorial expansion by force. It was the prohibition of such territorial conquests enshrined in the United Nations Charter, which the United States insisted had to be upheld by launching the Gulf War in 1991, reversing Iraq's conquest of Kuwait. Now, the United States is essentially saying that an Arab country invading and annexing its small southern neighbor based on dubious historical claims is legitimate after all. Trump cited Morocco's so-called autonomy plan for the territory as serious, credible, and realistic, and claimed it was the only basis for a just and lasting solution. However, Morocco's proposal falls way short of the international legal definition of autonomy and in effect would simply continue the occupation. Morocco's autonomy plan is vague as to the extent in which it would provide for genuine autonomy, which is particularly disturbing given how Morocco has broken quite a few promises regarding Western Sahara over the past 50 years. In addition, the record of autocratic states granting autonomy is not good. Remember what happened to Ethiopia's promised autonomy to Eritrea and to Serbia granting autonomy to Kosovo. The autonomy agreements were rescinded and it resulted in bloody wars in both cases. More fundamentally, Morocco's autonomy proposal presupposes that Western Sahara is already legally part of Morocco. As a UN-recognized non-self-governing territory, however, the people of Western Sahara have the right to self-determination, which necessarily includes the option of independence. I personally don't care what the people of Western Sahara choose. If they want to be incorporated into Morocco, that's fine. Though I think that would be highly unlikely. It's their choice. They must have the option of independence, however. Until that time, Western Sahara is still legally a colony. For years, the Moroccan government, through generous housing subsidies, tax breaks, and other benefits, has successfully encouraged tens of thousands of Moroccan settlers to move into the parts of Western Sahara under their control. These Moroccan settlers now outnumber the remaining Sahrawis indigenous to the territory by a ratio of more than 3 to 1. They have been illegally exploiting the territory's natural resources, particularly its phosphates and its fisheries. The Moroccan government also invested heavily in infrastructure development, along with internal security to suppress pro-independence activists. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other reputable human rights groups have documented widespread suppression by Moroccan occupation forces of peaceful advocates of independence. Freedom House has ranked Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara as one of the 12 least free nations in the world, ranking Western Sahara alongside Tibet, Uzbekistan, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia as among the worst of the worst. I personally have been to 85 countries, including Iraq under Saddam and Indonesia under Suharto, and I have found Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara to be the worst police state I have ever seen. Any and all pro-independence protests are broken up brutally. Detention without charge and torture are widespread. Disappearances and extrajudicial killings are not uncommon. This also raises serious questions about how genuine autonomy under the kingdom would actually be. Despite the repression, there has been impressive nonviolent resistance to the occupation. However, when the indigenous population is outnumbered by colonists, it makes it far more difficult to effectively use civil resistance than if you are in a majority. Diplomatically, there has been no progress either. For years, French and the United States have threatened to veto any UN Security Council resolutions that force Morocco to abide by its obligations. They have stymied efforts to place the issue of Western Sahara under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, which would give the international community the power to impose sanctions or put other appropriate leverage on Morocco to force the country to abide by the whole series of outstanding Security Council resolutions Morocco has regarded. First, to withdraw from the territory, and later to simply allow for a free and fair referendum on independence. After 29 years of a referendum that never came, and following a series of Moroccan ceasefire violations and other provocations, the Polisario resumed their armed struggle in November. With the United States recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, including the Polisario-controlled territory, it has now become, in the eyes of Washington, a civil war between a recognized government and a secessionist movement. While I personally do not believe the return to armed struggle is a good decision strategically, I do recognize that as a non-self-governing territory under foreign occupation, the people of Western Sahara legally have the right to do so. In both the Israeli and Moroccan occupations, for many years under different administrations, the United States has largely supported the occupying powers. But until Trump was president, previous administrations had recognized the dangerous legal precedent of formal recognition. Trump, both in regard to Israel and Morocco, made official what was essentially US policy anyway. For decades, both Republican and Democratic administrations have insisted that neither Morocco nor Israel was obligated to withdraw their occupying forces, instead allowing the occupying powers to engage in an endless peace process with those under occupation to have no leverage to change the equation, thereby allowing both occupiers to continue colonizing their occupied territories and consolidating control. As a result, Trump's insistence that the Golan Heights and parts of the West Bank and Greater Jerusalem are now part of Israel, and that the Western Sahara is now part of Morocco, simply codifies what the occupying powers have been saying for decades, knowing they would not receive any real pressure from the United States to end their legal occupations. Such occupations are still illegal, however, whether the United States acknowledges it or not. As president, Biden could reverse Trump's recognition of the Moroccan annexation with his signature. However, this would probably mean that Morocco would then renounce its recognition of Israel, and Biden, who strongly supports recognition of Israel by Arab states, appears to be reluctant to do so. In response to a direct question 2 days ago, a State Department spokesperson stated that there had been no decision yet regarding Trump's recognition of Morocco's illegal annexation of Western Sahara. The one positive side to these recent events is that finally people are realizing that there are two major occupations in the Arab world. The Sahrawis, no less than the Palestinians, deserve their freedom. What the Palestinians have, though, that the Sahrawis do not, is they have a broad, active global civil society campaign on their behalf. There are frequent demonstrations in support of Palestine. It is a frequent forum for discussions at universities, in church groups, and in other forums. Not as much with Western Sahara. There is a global campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions targeting the Israeli occupation. Such a campaign is not, what there is of one, is not nearly as well known or as well organized. Given the critical role the United States, France, and other countries have had in making Morocco's occupation possible, the mobilization of global civil society is critically important. Indeed, it may be the only choice. I do not believe armed struggle will work. Nonviolent resistance inside the territories, unfortunately, will not work. The diplomatic route is not working. That leaves it to global civil society. Such activism in the 1990s played a major role in ending the support by the United States, Great Britain, Australia, and other nations of Indonesia's illegal occupation of Timor-Leste. Similar efforts to effectively shame Morocco's backers in Paris, Washington, Madrid, and elsewhere to end their support for the occupation of Western Sahara may be the best hope for peace. I was active in the solidarity struggle for Timor-Leste, and 25 years ago, it seemed like a hopeless cause. Nobody, it seemed, in much of the world had even heard of Timor-Leste, even among activists concerned with human rights. But slowly, gradually, a movement emerged from the bottom up. José Ramos Horta was traveling by coach, sleeping on the couches of supporters, speaking to a small number of people in the basement of a church. But gradually, the movement grew. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, along with Bishop Bello. A number of scandals regarding the support Indonesia was getting from democracies made it easy to point out the hypocrisy and the horror that the world's great democracies were supporting such a brutal illegal annexation. Australia even recognized formally Indonesia's annexation, just as Trump recognized Western Sahara. And yet, all of these were reversed because civil society organized. We mobilized. In Europe, in North America, in Australia, and around the world, we must do the same for Western Sahara. That is the only and the best hope.
I thank you, Professor Tunis. You are right. Public awareness and grassroots action is essential for a change in Western Sahara. And in particular, in these three countries, including the United States, hoping that they will play a constructive role, although we know we are aware of this objective support of the United States to the Kingdom of Morocco since the beginning in 1975, notably militarily. And even today, the United States is providing almost 90% of the Moroccan armament, which is used also in Western Sahara. And there also, there is an incoherence in the human rights policy at the international level. The United States is always condemning violation of human rights in Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, now Myanmar, but they don't say nothing about Western Sahara. They just offer to include a human rights component in the MINURSO some years ago, but then when France opposed, they just walked away and they leave it like that, which is pity. Et pour terminer, je vais maintenant donner la parole à son Excellence Oubi Bachir Boushraya, qui est ministre pour l'Europe de la République arabe sahraoui démocratique et représentant auprès de l'Union européenne. Monsieur le ministre, vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. My brother from Timor-Leste, who is chairing the Geneva group, and thank you very much, Gianfranco, for moderating this conference. It is in fact very timely and important to organize this conference in order to address the UN failure to permit the Sahrawis to exercise their right to self-determination, especially at this juncture now where the ceasefire is no longer there and the political process lasted since the 13th of November as a direct result for the Moroccan military intervention around the area of Gergerat. I mean, to start with, and I think that the UN failure in Western Sahara is indeed a multiple failure, especially since since 1991 and the establishment of the MINURSO. First of all, at the level of the UN Security Council, there was the undemocratic process of adopting resolutions in Western Sahara that corresponded in many times to the interests of some of the powerful members, and more than really the interest of the just and lasting and legal settlement of the decolonization conflict in Western Sahara, or on the basis of its own resolution. I mean, in this regard, the establishment of the so-called group of friends of Western Sahara was really an instrument to maintain this undemocratic process. Because of the process of adopting, drafting the resolution and all of that, but also because of the fact that it contains only the powerful members, the P5, but at the place of China, there is Spain as the former colonizer and the actual administering power of Western Sahara. But the fact that there is no any African countries sitting in that group of friends of Western Sahara inside the Security Council contributed in silencing the voice of the African countries, because the conflict is primarily an African, and the African Union was the initiator of the whole process with its famous resolution 104 that led to this joint mission between the UN and the Organization of African Unity by then. We just see and go through the resolutions, the different resolutions adopted by the Security Council during the last years, and we see how the formulas and how the way in which the resolutions were formulated, it was almost an invitation to go nowhere. Almost. So we lost the original course of the process, and we ended up having some formulas that they cannot be, and they are almost leading nowhere. That's the first element about the Security Council. The second one is this insensitivity towards the Sahrawi concerns, especially when it comes to the issue of human rights as an example, and the incapacity of the Security Council to decide about entitling the MINURSO with the mandate to supervise the human rights in Western Sahara. And versus this insensitivity towards the concerns of the Sahrawi people, there were always a tendency to accommodate the Moroccan demands inside the UN Security Council recent resolutions. Of course, also one of the elements is the failure of the UN Security Council to upgrade the conflict from the chapter 6 to chapter 7, especially at some moments when we had the sort of breakthrough at reach. We remember all Baker's plan in 2003 that was adopted by the Security Council, but then Morocco managed to go along with the, refusing the proposal. And of course, we think that on a retrospective now vision, that maybe upgrading the conflict by then, that would have given a golden opportunity to the Security Council to settle the conflict by then. But in general, there was a lack of political will within the Security Council to settle the conflict, a proof of which is the fact that now we are heading to the 4th month of the war in Western Sahara, and there is no a single meeting dedicated to Western Sahara and to explore the situation and the way on the way forward. At the level of the UN General Secretariat, of course, the reports of the UN Secretary General did not reflect all the time the reality on ground, especially on those points that they would embarrass Morocco. On issues of human rights, there were always almost no reference or very shy reference to what's going on the occupied territories. And we know that there is a drama taking place for, especially since 2005 until now. Also, one of those issues that were deliberately omitted by the UN General Secretary General, the UN Secretary General reports was any reference to the European Court of Justice decisions on 2016 or 2018. And those decisions meant really a major development in the conflict in Western Sahara, yet they have been omitted from having any reference to by the Secretary General in his report. Of course, there is no any in situ visit to the region by the General Secretary of the UN after the one undertaken by Ban Ki-moon in 2016, and that was boycotted by Morocco. In 2016, you would recall that we were very close to resume the armed struggle with Morocco in August 2016. And we have been warning the UN Secretary General that the ceasefire is and that the only way to avoid an eventual or an imminent collapse of the ceasefire is to invest a lot on the political process. Yet the Secretary General left the process with no with no pilot in command for 1.5 years with no special envoy after the resignation of Kohler. And then that was of the issue. That was one of the causes that led to what happened on November 13. At the level of the MINURSO, which is the UN mission on ground of the UN, of course, that is one of the cases of the failure of the UN. They failed in organizing its initial mandate, which is a referendum of self-determination, failed in getting any sort of protection for the human rights of the people in Western Sahara, and failed also to grant any sort of protection to the natural resources of a non-self-governing territory, which is Western Sahara, according to the international law. Even on a very small, minor issues, such as the plates of the cars and the stamps on the passports and all of that, we have been presenting some complaints to the UN mission and failed. They are still circulating with cars with the Moroccan matriculation, which means that, even on the very single and easy issues, the MINURSO was not able to progress at all. At the end of the day, MINURSO was reduced just with a very limited mission, is to observe the ceasefire in Western Sahara. In a way, in other words, being converted in an instrument to maintain the status quo in the territory. And we know that it was only Morocco that was benefiting from that status quo. So no progress in the three elements of its initial mission. For us, at the end of the day, I mean, when we have been demanded, I mean, to keep on cooperating with the MINURSO, if there was a sort of asking the Polisario or the Polisario army to be converted in additional guards to protect the occupation of our own country. So the UN is not moving, and we have been asked to keep on also as an additional element in maintaining the status quo together with the MINURSO, something that could not be sustained anymore, especially after the frustration that was felt by the Sahrawis. This multi-failure generated within Morocco a sort of feeling of impunity. And that feeling of impunity was the direct reason behind the collapse of the whole process on November 13. Because if it was not because of that feeling of impunity, Morocco wouldn't dare to, one, military invade a demilitarized area, according to the Article 1 of the ceasefire, wouldn't dare to occupy a new part of the territory that was not under its occupation before 1991, and of course wouldn't also dare to extend the military wall to include a new part of Western Sahara. So Morocco knows that there won't be any denunciation for those acts, not by the UN Security Council, by the UN Secretary General, and unfortunately that was the case so far until now. So in such conditions or circumstances, the Frente Polisario was left with no option but to react in legitimate defense and declare the armed struggle, which is the reality now prevailing, unfortunately, in Western Sahara. Morocco is still denying the existence of the war, and we know that this is not the first time that Morocco denies such defying reality for its allegations. In 1975, denied the existence of the Polisario and kept on denying the war, and even the Moroccan prisoners of war until somewhere around mid-80s, where the reality was there. So Morocco ended up accepting and recognizing the reality and signing the ceasefire with the Polisario front. But now, think that the political reason behind the Moroccan continuing denial of the war is the sort of illusion that still Morocco has, that we may still go back to the reality that was prevailing there before November 13th. So the hope to maybe to get from the UN Security Council or some of his allies that we go back to the situation that was prevailing before, that's why I kept on denying the war, because recognizing the war will be a final break with the reality, and Morocco has to assume to face the consequences. But anyhow, is Morocco to be blamed for the consequences of this new instability and new war in Western Sahara, and all the consequences that may bring to the regional stability and even the Mediterranean stability? We, as Sahrawis, made all sorts of concessions throughout the last 3 decades just to avoid this dramatic turnout. But unfortunately, that was not very well appreciated by the UN, and especially the UN Security Council, and they kept on buying in the Moroccan point of view and the Moroccan propaganda. You would recall that in 1992, I mean, we started in 1991 with a referendum very clear, with 2 questions which are very clear, and the electoral body also on the basis of the Spanish census. In 1992, we agreed to enlarge the criterion of identification of the voters in the referendum. In 1995, we also conceded further concessions in that regard to accommodate some of the Moroccan demands with the so-called Boutros Ghali proposal. And then in 2003, we accepted the Baker's Plan, which meant really a huge concession for the Sahrawis, and the Polisario leadership had to face a lot of criticism from within our national public opinion for this decision. Baker's Plan contains the autonomy for between 4 and 5 years under the Moroccan sovereignty, and a referendum of self-determination where no longer only the Sahrawis have the right to vote, but also a big part of the Moroccan settlers will be granted the right to vote in that referendum. Yet Morocco refused also this proposal. And in 2007, we presented a package of 7 points in sort of guarantees for Morocco in case the referendum will lead to the independence, which consists in basically massive regularization of the Moroccan settlers in the territory, possibility of a joint economic exploitation of the natural resources of the territory between the new state and the Moroccan kingdom, also in a series of guarantees for the security of the border between the two countries, among others. So Morocco yet refused, and the Security Council didn't assume its responsibility in seizing those opportunities and force Morocco to accept and settle the conflict. All those concessions, I mean, it gives you the impression that Morocco is not willing at all to cooperate in any solution, and that maintaining the Western Sahara conflict as it is becomes an essential part of the sort of equilibrium of powers within Morocco, but also the legitimacy of the monarchy, which of course was consolidated with the conflict and with the beginning of the conflict in 1975. Now, the question is how to further avoid the escalation, and if there is a way left to rescue the UN failed mission in Western Sahara. Of course, in principle, as the Frente Polisario remain committed and open to any negotiation process, of course, within a framework that is different from the one that was existing before, a new format, because we know that the old format prior to November 13th failed, and we have learned the lesson very well. So the new format means clear end of the process of this decolonization, an objective that is very well determined. Of course, in conformity with the resolutions of the UN and the international and legal status of the territory. Very well defined timetable towards that objective, but of course, very solid and serious guarantees. Those are, I mean, this is in principle the position of the Polisario Front, and we think that there is no contradiction between carrying on with the armed struggle and at the same time negotiating for a peaceful solution. That was the experience we learned from many other movements of liberation in the past. At this stage now, and after more than 3 months of the armed struggle, we think that the UN system as a whole is requested urgently to take some steps to recover the trust of the Sahrawis and their friends. I mean, limited the calls for a return to a political process means in a way that we have been called to return to nowhere, because there was no political process in place going on in Western Sahara. And we think that there is a need first, one, to address the dysfunctional UN political efforts to settle the conflict that led to the break of the ceasefire and the collapse of the political process. Maybe an extraordinary meeting of the UN Security Council dedicated exclusively to Western Sahara, where the two parties on equal basis would have the possibility to address the Security Council and explain their points of view, that may constitute one of the steps required in this sense. But also a visit to the territory by the UN Secretary General to meet with the two parties and listen to the grievance of the people is also required. And of course, on the issue of human rights, the UN Human Rights Council is, especially in those days where we witness a massive campaign of violations of human rights in the territory, a sort of revenge by the Moroccan authorities on the Sahrawi civilians, a visit of observation by a mission from the UN Human Rights Council is indeed very urgent and requested, and we think that it would also help to recover a sort of this trust within the Sahrawis and their friends and allies. And to conclude, I think that continuing to turn the back to the new reality in Western Sahara from the UN system is at the same time, I mean, dangerous, but also comforts Morocco in its position of denial of this reality and its feeling of impunity. The three countries mentioned in this conference, the USA, France, and Spain, have had a particular responsibility in the failure of the UN to address the conflict of Western Sahara. And we think that they were responsible for the failure. They could be responsible also to the success of the UN in Western Sahara. So, and I think that the elements of those contributions by the three countries have been sufficiently raised by the panelists, and in my voice to them. And we hope that the three countries, the US, because of this, it's a superpower, would of course reconsider the position that was announced by, I mean, the legal proclamation that was announced by Trump, and that Spain would assume its particular responsibility as an administering power, as a country that is responsible directly for the drama going on in Western Sahara, and of course France, because of its role throughout the history as the main protector of Morocco. So they have been using those status in the past to bring the UN to the actual failure. I think the same attributes could be used to guarantee a sort of success in Western Sahara, and granting the people the right of self-determination via a referendum with the guarantees and with the timetable, and within a new format that is different from the one of the past. I thank you for your attention.
I thank you, Minister. Indeed, Sahrawi people and the Polisario Front has made many concessions in this long history of occupation, maybe too many. And this is also why Moroccan authorities can enjoy impunity at the international level for all the violations during these years. Pour conclure, je pense que, comme l'a souligné le professeur Tsounes, la société civile a un rôle important à jouer. à jouer chacun dans son domaine, que ce soit académique, politique, juridique, pour aider le peuple sahraoui enfin à accéder à l'exercice de son droit légitime à l'autodétermination et à l'indépendance. Tous les outils doivent pouvoir être utilisés sans concurrence, mais de manière complémentaire. Nous allons publier les actes de cette conférence et dans plusieurs langues, et nous allons les distribuer largement auprès des missions diplomatiques, de la presse et des organisations non gouvernementales. Et évidemment, nous allons le publier également sur le site web du groupe de Genève de soutien pour le Sahara occidental. C'est genevaforwesternsahara.org. genevaforwesternsahara in one word.org. Et enfin, je tiens à remercier tous les intervenants, et peut-être particulièrement l'ambassadeur Fonseca, qui est resté avec nous à une heure très tardive chez lui, ainsi que le professeur Zounes, qui a dû se lever très tôt pour participer à cette conférence, et remercier évidemment tous ceux qui ont assisté tout au long de ces 2 heures. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde, et je vous quitte en exprimant l'espoir que le droit pourra enfin avoir le dessus sur les jeux politiques des grandes puissances et que le peuple sahraoui puisse accéder à exercer son droit à l'autodétermination et à l'indépendance. Merci beaucoup à tous.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Gracias.